Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining this Early Career Mathematicians seminar. Today, we've got the winners of last year's tomorrow's Mathematicians Today conference, which is an undergraduate conference aimed at second and third years who do research in their free time or with their dissertations and things like that. So first up, we have Maria, who is at Heriot-Watt. And Maria will be talking to us about the geometric methods for community detection, discrete notions of curvature in graphs, and clustering in the hyperbolic space, as you can see on your screen. Maria is a final year student and was a second year last year when she originally gave not this talk, but something that won her the award. She's originally from Barcelona, where she lived for the first 18 years of her life before moving to not so sunny Scotland for her undergraduate degree. Interestingly, during her degree, she spent a year exchange at the University of Waterloo, which is in Canada, and then a year in industry working as a technology consultant at Ernst & Young, which was in London. Next year, she is continuing her studies at Oxford, doing a master's in mathematical science. And of her interests in mathematics, it's the intersection of geometry, topology, and machine learning, which is possibly what we're going to hear about today. So, Maria, would you like to say which award that you won last year?
With this presentation?
Yes.
It was the IMA prize. You didn't have to like that.
It was the best presentation prize?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Maria, I'll hand over to you in a second. I forgot to do housekeeping. So for those who are with us here and not watching on YouTube, please just keep your self muted. If it's getting a bit choppy, then turn your video off to try and keep the connection strong. We will do questions once the talk is finished, and then we'll be moving on to Veronica, who I will introduce at that time. So Maria, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, James. So, yes, he said, in this talk, I will be talking about geometric methods for community detection, in particular about discrete notions of curvature in graphs and clustering in the hyperbolic space. So this is a combination of the talk that I presented in the Tomorrow's Mathematicians Today conference in 2023 and my final year dissertation that I have been working on this year. So to start the talk, I will just give some motivations around the topic, and then I will move on to talking about clustering in the hyperbolic space. So I will briefly give an introduction about hyperbolic geometry, and then I will explain how we can implement the k-means clustering algorithm in the hyperbolic space. And then the second half of the talk will focus on discrete notions of curvature in graphs. So in particular, I will talk about the Olliver Ricci curvature, and I will explain an algorithm that's called the Olliver Ricci Flow that is able to detect communities within a network. And finally, to finish up the talk, I will just provide some future directions on this field. So as you all know, now we generate a wide amount of data that comes with a variety of different structures. So for example, we can find grid-like data on images, structure and discrete data in speech, graphs in social network, or trees in phylogenetics, for example. So given a data set, we would like to find a way of understanding what's the underlying geometry and to incorporate this information into our machine learning algorithms. So this talk will focus in a specific problem in network analysis, and this is the community detection problem. So in this, the goal of this problem is to find groups of nodes that in some way are more similar to each other than to other nodes. So this is a very well-known studied problem in network analysis, but here I will explain how using some geometric notions can help us to bring like a new perspective on this topic. So for the first part of this presentation, we will be focusing only on hierarchical datasets. So a hierarchical dataset is a dataset in which the data is organized in a tree-like structure, as you can see with this image here. So these datasets are widely found like in nature, but they're also common in like social networks or phylogenetic trees, for example. So these datasets are discrete objects, but usually when we want to implement machine learning algorithms, we need to embed them in a continuous space. So when we want to embed these large and hierarchical datasets into the Euclidean space, we basically face two main problems. So the first problem we face is that the nodes at the leaves get clustered and clusters together as the tree goes deeper. And this is because the number of nodes in a tree grows exponentially with the distance to the root, as you can see with this image here. But the Euclidean space is only growing polynomially. And this clustering of leaves at the nodes can affect the performance of the algorithms because it can cause overfitting, for example. And then the second problem that we run into when we try to embed these hierarchical data sets into Euclidean space is that the Euclidean distance doesn't really represent the distance between nodes in a graph. So just as a reminder, the distance between two nodes in a graph is the number of edges in the shortest path connecting them. So for example, the distance between these two nodes in green here is 2. So the distance is a very important metric for the machine learning algorithms, as is a way of measuring the similarity between the nodes. So ideally, we want that the metric that we use in the algorithms to be as close as possible to this graph distance that we find in this type of data sets. But nevertheless, as we can see here with these diagrams on the right-hand side, and this Euclidean distance is very different from this tree distance that we would like to achieve. For example, if we look at these two nodes in purple, we can see that the Euclidean distance between two nodes is larger than the distance between these blue nodes, even though the nodes in purple are clearly closer in the tree than the blue nodes. And that's why using this Euclidean distance when working with this type of data sets can lead to some inaccuracies in the algorithms. So before we can understand how the hyperbolic geometry can help us with these two problems, I will provide a very quick introduction to this non-Euclidean geometry. So as most of you will know, hyperbolic geometry is a non-Euclidean geometry with constant Gaussian curvature of -1. So there's main 5 models of hyperbolic space that I listed here on the right. And these 5 models are all isometric to each other. But in this talk, we'll be focusing on the Poincaré disk model. So the Poincaré disk model can be defined as a set of complex numbers with norms smaller than 1. So we decided to work with this data set because it is bounded. And this provides a very intuitive way of visualizing our hierarchical data set. So we can also equip this disk with a metric. So here on the right, you can see the explicit formula between the distance between 2 points induced by this metric. And this formula, it actually has like very important properties that will be very useful for our community detection problem. For example, if we take two nodes x and y, and we place y at the origin of the disk, then if we move x in a straight line towards the boundary, the hyperbolic distance between x and y will increase exponentially as x gets closer and closer to the boundary. So now coming back to the two problems that I mentioned a couple of slides ago. So the first problem was that the nodes at the leaves were getting clustered because the number of nodes in a tree grows exponentially, but the Euclidean plane only grows polynomially. So actually the hyperbolic space also grows exponentially, as you can see here with the formula for the perimeter of a circle and the area of a circle in the hyperbolic space. So for example, if we look at this image that I have here on the right, we can see that every black edge has exactly the same hyperbolic distance. So this gives us a very intuitive way of embedding a hierarchical data set into the Poincaré disk, because we can just place the root of our data set near the origin and the leaves near the boundary, and this will resolve our problem of nodes getting clusters together at the leaves. And then the second problem that we had is that this Euclidean distance was not really representing the distance between nodes in a graph. So for this, let's take two nodes x and y, and let's place their parent set at the origin of the disks. Then, as I said before, we have that the graph distance between x and y will be the distance between x and the origin plus the distance between y and the origin. And normalizing, we get to this ratio here. So now we would like to see how this ratio changes as x and y move in a straight line towards the boundary. So if we're using the Euclidean distance, this ratio will always remain constant. In fact, it will only depend on the angle between x and y. But if we're using the hyperbolic distance instead, this ratio will tend to 1 as x and y gets closer to the boundary, as you can see with this graph here on the right. So what this means is that for points closer to the boundary, the hyperbolic distance can get arbitrarily close to this graph distance that we like to achieve. And that's why using this metric in our algorithms instead of the Euclidean one can provide us a unique advantage. So now that we know some of the advantages that working in the hyperbolic space can provide us when working with these hierarchical data sets, I decided to implement sorry. I decided to implement one algorithm in the hyperbolic space. So in this case, I choose to implement the k-means clustering algorithm. So probably some of you will have heard of this algorithm before, but just to quickly summarize how it works in the Euclidean plane. So in this case, we first need to embed the data into the Euclidean space. And then we initialize k-random centroids, which are represented with these two squares in step 2. Then what we do is to calculate the distance between each data point and each centroid, and we assign each data point to the closest centroid. And then finally, we update the location of the centroid by taking the arithmetic mean between all the points in the same cluster. And then we repeat this procedure until we get into a stopping criteria. So as you may be guessing, the hyperbolic version of this algorithm will be very similar to the Euclidean one, but we'll just have to make a few changes in some of the steps. So for example, like in the first one, instead of embedding the data into the Euclidean plane, we will need to embed them into the Poincare disk instead. And then instead of calculating the Euclidean distance between the points and the centroid, we'll have to calculate the hyperbolic distance using this expression that I showed you before. And then finally, instead of using the arithmetic mean to update the location of the centroid, we'll need to use the Frechet mean. So the Frechet mean is just a generalization of the arithmetic mean for metric spaces, and it can be defined as the argmin of this error function that I have here. So in this function, theta is the centroid and x sub y is its data point. So we're basically calculating the distance between each centroid and each data point as we were doing in the Euclidean space as well. But the difference is that in this case, this distance will be the hyperbolic distance. So as you can see, to calculate this Frechet mean, we actually have to solve an optimization problem, and we will solve that using the method of gradient descent. But first, so if you remember now, we're working in the Poincare disk. But to perform this optimization algorithm, we will actually map the points to another model of the hyperbolic space. That's called the hyperboloid. And this is because this model is more numerically stable and the computations are easier. So what we'll do is to map all the points from the Poincare disk to the hyperboloid, then implement this gradient descent, and then map them back to the Poincare disk in order to visualize them. So here there's a quick summary on how the gradient descent is implemented in the hyperboloid. So first, we need to calculate the gradient of this error function that I had in the last slide. And this is this red vector that we have here. And then we project the vector into the tangent space to get rid of the normal component. And we use the exponential map to get a point back in the manifold. And in this case, alpha is the learning rate for our the gradient descent algorithm. So now I decided to implement the Euclidean version and the hyperbolic version of this algorithm to a real-world dataset in order to compare both of its performance. So in this case, I use a network from a large European institution, and this network has slightly more than 1,000 nodes. And every node represents an employee of this institution. So two nodes are connected if these employees have changed at least one email. So there's also a way that we have to see if the dataset is hyperbolic or not, that I didn't include in this presentation due to the time constraints, but this is called Gromov hyperbolicity. And in this case, we indeed get that this dataset has a strong hyperbolicity. We could also have guessed that the structure of this dataset due to the hierarchical properties that most organizations have. But yeah, anyway, in this case, we have the ground truth labels of the dataset. So we know that this institution has 42 departments, and we know exactly at what department does each employee belong to. So what we want to do is to implement both the Euclidean algorithm and the hyperbolic algorithm and see if we're able to correctly detect these 42 communities. So here you can see the Euclidean and the hyperbolic embeddings. So I will not get into too much detail about the embeddings, but for the Euclidean ones, I just use the ones provided by the Network X library and Python. And for the hyperbolic ones, I use the ones provided by this paper that I cited here below. And here you can see the clustering that we have obtained. And so the two diagrams on the left are the Euclidean clustering, and the one in the right is the Euclidean, the hyperbolic clustering, after applying like this k-means clustering algorithm. So as you can see, the Euclidean algorithm clusters the data a lot more by chunks due to the properties of the Euclidean distance. And the hyperbolic algorithm clusters the data a lot more vertically due to the geodesic structure of the Poincare disk in this case. So for example, you can notice that this blue node has been clustered with this blue cluster instead of the orange one, even though it looks like it should be closer than to the orange one. So to actually compare like the performance of the algorithms, I used a metric that's called the adjusted grant index that compares the groups that we have obtained with the grant truth labels that we have for our data set. And for the Euclidean cluster, we obtain a score of 0.2, and for the hyperbolic one, a score of 0.5. So indeed, in this case, we got that the performance of the hyperbolic algorithm was higher than the Euclidean one. Okay, so far we have seen how how embedding the data into a different non-Euclidean space can provide us an advantage when working with certain types of data sets. But now we will look at a different idea. And here we want to define a geometric notion directly on our network. So we should be able to detect communities only using intrinsic properties of the graph without needing embeddings into any spaces. So we will do this through discrete notions of curvature. So as you all know, the notion of curvature is usually found in the context of differential manifold and differential geometry. And there's quite different notions that can be defined, but they all seek to capture the deviation of an object from being flat. So this talk will focus on the Ricci curvature. So due to the time constraints, I will not provide the formal definition, but I will explain one of the main characterizations of this curvature. So here I'm given a manifold M, which can take 2 points close to each other, x and y, and calculate the distance between them along a geodesic gamma. We can then take a vector v with the tangent space of x, and parallel transport it along gamma to a vector v prime in the tangent space of y. Then we project x along v back to the manifold again to obtain x prime, and we do the same with y to obtain y prime, and we recalculate the distance between these 2 points. So notice that we can repeat this process for every possible direction of v. And then we get to this well-known formula that relates the upright distance between x prime with y prime with the Ricci curvature at the point. So in this expression, epsilon is the radius of this small geodesic ball, and n is the dimension of the manifold. So from this formula, we can infer that when the Ricci curvature is positive, then the average distance between small metric points so the average distance between small metric points is smaller than the distance between its centers. And when the Ricci curvature is negative, then we have the opposite situation. So now we'll want to define a similar measure, but in the context of graphs. So as graphs don't have a differential structure, we cannot define the curvature in the same way, but instead we have to use some kind of analogies. So the Olliver Ricci curvature is an edge-based curvature that can be formulated in terms of an optimal transfer problem. So in this case, to define the curvature of an edge x and x turning to nodes xy, what we'll do is to define a mass distribution around node x and a mass distribution around node y, and find the best way of transporting one distribution to the other. So the mass distribution around the node x is defined in the following way. So here we put alpha mass at x, and we equidistribute the rest of the mass among the neighbors. So alpha is a parameter that's called the idleness because it can be seen as the probability of a random worker to not move. And then we produce this set of transfer plans that move one distribution to the other. So these transfer plans is just how to satisfy some logical conditions. For example, the first one, it ensures that all the masses that we move from a node k in the neighborhood of x to all the nodes in the neighborhood of y equals to the mass initially at k. And the second condition is similar, but with a node in the neighborhood of y. And then we just define this Wasserstein distance between the two distributions as the infimum among all the set of transfer plans times a cost function, which in this case is the graph distance between the nodes. And finally, we get that the curvature of this edge x and y in function of the parameter alpha is 1 minus the ratio between this Wasserstein distance and the distance between the nodes. So just to get a quick example of how this will work in practice, if we want to calculate the curvature of this edge x and y, and we set alpha to be equal to 0.2, we first need to define the mass distribution around x and the mass distribution around y. So for the mass distribution around x, we put 0.2 mass at x, and we distribute the rest of the mass among the neighbors. And we do the same with the mass distribution around y. So as this is a simple graph, it's quite easy to see what's the optimal transfer plan. But in this case, it will consist on moving all the mass to node x. Then we leave 0.27 mass at x, and we move the rest to node y. And we leave 0.2 mass there, and we equidistribute among the remaining neighbors. So in this way, you can quickly get the value of the curvature of that edge. So this construction may look a bit artificial, but in fact, it has a deep connection to the Ricci curvature in manifolds that I briefly explained before. So broadly speaking, both notions reflect the fact that when the curvature is positive, the upright distance between points in small metric balls is smaller than the distance between its centers. So in the continuous case, you have that these balls are just metric balls, and the distance is the distance induced by the metric of the manifold. And in the discrete case, we have that these balls are discrete masses distributions, and the distance is this Wasserstein's distance from optimal transport theory. So then, as we had in the continuous case, we'll have that graphs with a tree-like structure will tend to have a negative curvature. And this is because the mass distribution around adjacent nodes will not overlap as much. So we'll need to move a lot of mass to go from one distribution to the other. And on the other hand, graphs that have a clique-like structure and that are highly connected are going to be the graphs with a higher positive curvature. So as you can see, this notion of curvature already gives us a lot of information on what's the structure of our network. But we would like to go one step further and to define an algorithm that, given a graph, it finds a set of edge weights to flatten the curvature of the graph. So I will not show you all the steps of the algorithm because it's quite long, but I will illustrate you how it works with an example that I implemented in practice. So here I use the Zachary Karate Club dataset, which is like a very small social network that contains two communities. So as you can see in the left, you can see and the weights and the curvature of the edges before applying this Ricci Flow algorithm. So as you can see in the lower left diagram, the weights of all the edges are 1, and this is because initially this is an unweighted network, and the curvature of the edges ranges from -2 to 1. So then after applying the Ricci Flow, you can see that the curvature of all edges has converged to 0, as you can see with the right upper diagram. And that's why we say that this algorithm flattens the curvature of the graph, while the weights of the edges have been updated. So now if we look at as the weight as a measure of distance between the adjacent nodes, we can see that these nodes that are connected by these purple edges have gotten arbitrarily close together, as the weight of the purple edges is very close to 0. And they have moved far apart from the nodes from this other group. And this is because the weight of these yellow edges has increased. So in general, what we will have is that nodes that are connected in different communities, and so we're called intercommunity edges, will tend to have a negative curvature, as you can see here as well in the left upper diagram. And these edges with negative curvature are the ones that will tend to expand through the Ricci flow. And on the other hand, edges that are inside a community will tend to have a positive curvature, and this type of edges will tend to shrink throughout the Ricci flow. And this is how we will try to detect the different communities of a network. So I decided to implement this algorithm, to test this algorithm in a real-world dataset. And in this case, I choose a dataset from an American football division. So this dataset has 150 nodes, and every node represents a different football team. So to note if connected if these two teams have played at least one match against each other. So we also know that this division has 12 conferences, and that are represented with these 12 colors here on the right. So we would like to implement this algorithm to see if we're able to detect these 12 different groups. So for here in this case, I had to choose a much smaller data set than I had to do last time. And this is because Ricci Flow algorithm is actually very computationally expensive, because for every iteration, it has to calculate the curvature of all the edges of the graph, which involves solving this optimal transfer problem. So for very big and highly connected data sets, this algorithm is actually unfeasible. But yeah, and to detect the communities, we have to add one extra step. And what we will do is that when the weight of an edge has expanded above a different certain threshold, then we'll consider that the two nodes adjacent to it are far apart enough from each other, and we will remove this edge from the graph. So this weight threshold is actually the most important parameter for the performance of the algorithm. So for example, if we put a weight threshold that is too high, as you can see here on the left, then we will obtain fewer communities than we want to, So if you remember, we needed to obtain 12 groups, and in this case, we only obtained 4. But if we put a threshold that is too small, as you can see on the diagram on the right, then we will obtain isolated nodes that don't belong to any community. And obviously, this is like not ideal either. So to find the optimal threshold, what I did is to use this adjusted rand index again. So this index compares the communities that we are having from the algorithm with our branches labels that we have from our dataset. And you can see that the optimal threshold appears around 1.7. So we use this threshold, we are able to detect the communities quite accurately, as you can see here on the right. There's only like a few nodes that have been misclassified, but for most part of it, it has been able to detect it correctly. So in this talk, we have seen how using both extrinsic and intrinsic notions of curvature can help us in this community detection problem. But in fact, this problem is a lot more broader than that. So the embedding in non-Euclidean spaces has found many applications, especially in computer vision. And the notion of curvature has been very important to study the way that information flows in a graph. And for example, it has been applied to study the curvature of the internet, or even to study the stability of the financial markets. And it has also found applications to study the oversquashing phenomenon in graph neural networks. So I hope that you found this topic interesting and that you will be happy to learn more about it after listening to this talk. And yeah, if you have any questions, I will be very happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Maria, for the very interesting and applicable talk. When I read through the abstract, I was like, this is going to be a theoretical one, but actually you can clearly see the applications involved here are like numerous. Thank you for that data set as well. I didn't know about the snap data set. So I saw it and I was like, oh, just like quickly wrote it down. So I was like, this is like so much good information there. So yeah, I have a few questions. Does anyone else in the audience want to pop in and say hello and with any questions? I'll give it like well, maybe you're writing, so I'll let you write and I'll go with the first one. So it's sort of the question I have is I've got the same question twice really, which is you use the adjusted rand index, of course, to get this cutoff weight. Do you think there's like a different way to try and get that parameter? Like I was thinking about applications where maybe you don't know what the labels are in the clusters and you want to actually label them. But then you might need to think about the hyperparameter. Have you thought about that for both the cutoff weight and the alpha in the Wasserstein?
Yeah, so the alpha is usually they usually use like a small value, like normally below like 0.5. And it's because it's found that the algorithm converts faster. But for the cutoff weight, I think it would be more like trial and error because it will depend more on the structure of the dataset. So in this case, this dataset had like a very clear like community structure. So the algorithm actually converts quite quickly. It was like in less than 10 iterations. But in datasets which the community structure is a lot less clear and a lot less like structured than this like conference and teams think, then probably it will need like a smaller smaller cutoff weight.
Yeah, choosing those hyperparameters is always a bit tricky.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds pretty reasonable. And I see there's no other questions, so I'll go with my other one and then we'll move on. But with the k-means stuff, what's the speed like between the Euclidean and the hyperbolic methods? Is the hyperbolic like slower than the Euclidean?
Yeah, the hyperbolic is actually like a lot slower than the other one, and this is because, well, mainly it's because of this gradient descent that it has to perform, because in the Euclidean algorithm, to update the location of the centroids, We just need to take like the normal arithmetic mean.
Yeah.
But then to map all those points from the point quality to the hyperboloid and perform this gradient descent until it converges to a close enough minimum, and then map them back. It's actually a lot more like computationally expensive.
How much time are we talking?
I don't remember exactly because yeah, this one is I did it like I implemented it last year.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was way longer.
Right. Okay. And then, so my follow-up question was, are there situations where the hyperbolic method is not as good as the Euclidean? But I suppose that's probably when you have a lot of data, it becomes computationally expensive. Is there any
Yeah.
other situations where you would not use the hyperbolic?
Yeah, so the hyperbolic is mainly good only if you're working with these like hierarchical data sets.
Yeah.
But for other types of data sets, for example, the American football data set that it was not hierarchical, then the embeddings in the hyperbolic space will probably provide less performance than the Euclidean algorithm.
Ah,
So yeah, we have to make sure that the data set is hyperbolic. The thing is like in real life, some of the data sets have so we have to make sure the data set is hierarchical. And in real life, like we can kind of guess that the structure may be a bit hierarchical, but obviously it's not going to be like 100% hierarchical most of the times. So yeah, like the data set has to show like strong hyperbolicity to like benefit from these embeddings.
makes sense. Makes sense. Okay. Ali has a question in the chat. Ali, you're welcome to say your question out loud if you want, or I can do it.
Sure. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
So I was in the audience in TMT 23, and I'm just wondering if you've made any progress since the 2023 talk, if you'd like to talk about it, or if
Um,
this is mentioning like some of the progress that you've made.
yeah, so this is a work that I did in summer before so summer 2022. So yeah, I've not been working on this project like the hyperbolic project anymore. But yeah, the dissertation that I did on the curvature of graphs was kind of related to this one. Where yeah, it was just detecting communities using like some geometric notion. So yeah, to answer this question on the hyperbolic side of it, I then work on it further after that.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ali. Okay, so keeping an eye on time, let's thank Maria again for the great talk. I'm trying to clap my hand. There we go. I got it. Yeah, thank you so much. You can now give your voice a little bit of a rest and sit back for Veronica's talk. So Veronica is here to talk about the quest for structure, continued fractions in enumerative combinatorics. So the bio about Veronica, she's a final year undergraduate student at UCL. Even though she's still at the beginning of her academic career, the area she would like to work on is combinatorics and complexity theory. In particular, she has done reading projects on Turing machines, which provided the basis for the presentation at TMT 2022, or is it 23? Yes, 22. So you've been to 3 conferences, 3
Yeah,
TMT.
basically.
Wow. Okay. Then she did a reading project at UCL and discovered Den's problem and the idea of undecidability in group theory, which was presented at TMT 23. And then we've got something here that we're going to listen about, which you presented at TMT 2024. So this is a fun fact about Veronica, when she is not doing maths, she is either doing archery or cultivating her passion for humanities. If she had not read maths at uni, she probably would have studied literature. So, Veronica, do you want to say which award you won as well at TMT 23?
Yeah, it was the Popular Prize vote, if I remember correctly the naming.
Yes, that seems about right, the Popular Prize. So,
Okay.
with that in mind, please feel free to take the stage.
Perfect. Yeah, so I'll share my screen. So 1 second. I actually have to share dual screen because then I'll need to use. Okay, perfect. Okay, so thank you very much, James, for the introduction, and thank you very much for, actually, let me put this here. So yeah, and thank you very much for this opportunity to talk at today's event. So today I'm going to talk about continued fractions in enumerative combinatorics, and in particular, I'm going to give an introduction to the field, and then I'm going to give a brief introduction on what we actually discovered together with Professor Sokol and Dr. Bishal Deb last year in my undergraduate research, my summer research project that was done through some funds of the UCL Maths department. So I would like to thank them as well for this amazing opportunity. So 1 second. Okay, perfect. So the first question that one can ask is like, what is specifically enumerative combinatorics? So enumerative combinatorics is that branch of mathematics that deals with counting number of ways that certain patterns arise. So an example is, for instance, to ask in how many ways we can permute the numbers that goes from 1 to n. And in a more formal way, we can say that enumerative combinatorics deals with families of finite sets. And in particular, for the case of the permutation, we will have that in that case, for instance, the combinatorial family is the family of permutations. And so the finite sets are the sets made of all the permutations on n letters. And therefore, in that case, the indexing set is going to be the natural numbers, which is more or less always the case. And so one of the main goals of enumerative combinatorics is to ask whether we can find a nice closed formulas that describes the cardinalities of these sets. So again, for instance, looking at the case of the permutations, we know that a nice closed formula indeed exists because as the number of permutations on n letters is given by n factorial. But it's not always the case to have the chance to actually manage to find this nice closed formula, and therefore we use some other tools which are mainly represented in our case by generating functions. So what are generating functions? A generating function is a representation of a sequence of number as coefficients of a power series. So in particular, the two main generating functions are the ordinary generating function and the exponential generating function. And these two types of power series, they need to be viewed as formal power series. So therefore, we're not interested in any notion of convergence or divergence, and thus the TNs merely represent the position that the SNs, the cardinalities of these sets actually, have within our sequence. And why are we interested in using formal power series when one of the main reasons is because they behave nicely? So we know how to add them, we know how to multiply them, and therefore when we need to find the generating function, these properties allowed us to do the calculation really nicely. And in particular, this is all due to the fact also that the formal power series forms an integral domain, and in particular is a principal ideal domain. Where all the ideals are of the forms of the TNs, brackets TNs. Okay, so in particular, with this in mind, we can see that one way to represent generating function is given by continued fractions. And I want to emphasize the fact that this is just one way to do such a thing, because for instance, another interesting way is given by ODEs. And for my research project, we focus mainly on the continued fractions representation, but there's like a few papers that we actually used for our conjecture at the end that actually uses the ODE's interpretation of generating function, which is actually also really, really interesting. So the three main continued fractions are the S fractions, the J fractions, and the T fractions. And as we can see, the main difference is given by the fact that in the case of the S fraction, we have all linear factors in terms of the T's, whereas for the J fractions, we both have linear factors and square factors, and T fractions are kind of like a mix of the two, in the sense that we have again we both have like two linear factors, but again there's two of them and it's not just one sequence. So in particular, Flageolet in the 1980s showed a really interesting connection between the S, J, and T fractions and the Dieck, Motzkin, and Schroeder paths. So it gave a specific combinatorial interpretation of these type of fractions. So what are these type of paths? So Dieck, Motzkin, and Schroeder path, they're all paths in the first quadrant of the plane. And in particular, the Dieck path, in the Dieck path, the steps that are allowed are the so-called rise and fall, both of them which have length 1. Whereas in the Motzkin path, not only we have these 2 steps, but we are allowed an extra step, which is called level step, which has again length 1. And finally, in the Schroeder path, we have again a level step, but this time is called long level step because it has a length of 2 rather than 1. And therefore, because of this, we have that the Dieck path is going to be a path that starts from the 0, so from the origin, from the 0, 0 point, and ends at a point of the form 2 and 0, so has even length. And in a similarly happens for the Schroeder path. And so we're going to see how this connection arises between the S fractions and the Dieck paths, in particular weighted Dieck paths, and I explain this weighted in a second, because this is the easiest way, the easiest case computationally speaking. But then in a similar way, one can do the same thing for the J and the T fraction and the Motzkin and Schroeder paths. So in particular, before seeing this connection, we first need to define the Stilter-Roger polynomials. So Stilter-Roger polynomials are the generating polynomial of like Dieck path, where each rise get a weight 1 and each fall from height I get a weight I. So in particular, what do I mean with that? So let's start first of all with like n being equal to 0, then in that case we just have a point. So the Stilter-Roger polynomial is just defined to be 1. But then when n is equal to 1, then in that case we are looking at Dieck path of length 2n, so it's going to be of length 2, and the only Dieck path of length 2 is the one given here in the slide. So now to find the Stilter-Roger polynomial, we need to find the total weight of this path, and the total weight of a path is given by the product of the weights of the individual steps. So now we have a rise, which, as I said, has a weight 1, and we have a fall from height 1, which therefore is going to have a weight alpha 1, because we start at a height 0, and every time we go up is going to be we're going to adding 1 in our height. So here we are at height 1. And then in a similar way, if we consider n to be 2, then we are looking at Dieck path of length 4, and therefore there are only 2 cases. And in particular, the Stilter-Roger polynomials is going to be given by the total weight, which in this case is given by the sum of the weights of the individual paths. So here again, the weight of this path is the product of the weights. So we have again a rise and a rise, and so it's going to be again a weight 1 for both of them. And then here we're going to fall from height 2, and so alpha 2 is going to be the weight, and similarly alpha 1 is the weight of this step. And in a similar way, we can find the weight of the second Dieck path, and therefore overall S2 is represented by this expression here on the left. And similarly, we can find S3, so the third Stilter-Roger polynomial, and we can continue in that way. So once we have defined this Stilter-Roger polynomials, then we can define the ordinary generating function for the weighted Dieck paths, and from that we can generalize it by letting fk to be the ordinary generating function for the Dieck path at level k, so that starts at a height k. And in particular, we have that the fkt then satisfies this functional equation. And why is that? So some motivation of how we can find this functional equation is given by the fact that if we consider a general Dieck path that starts and ends at weight k, at height k, then we can actually split it into Dieck path that starts and end at height k, which is the yellow bit which is going to have ordinary generating function fk, And then we also have a green bit, which is instead a dig path that starts and ends at height k+1. And so it's the green bit and is represented, and the generating function is then going to be fk+1. And then we have these blue bits that are a dig path of length 2. And in particular, we have that the rise is going to have weight 1 and the fall is going to have a weight alpha k+1, because we're going from level k+1 to level k, and thus for the definition of the Stilter-Roger polynomials that we've seen in the previous slide, then we have that this blue bit is represented by t times alpha k+1. And then, but then we also need to consider the fact that a dig path at level k can also be just represented by a point, and this is describes the +1 that we have in this functional equation. And now, iterating that expression and iterating again and again, we get that fkt equals this expression here in the form of a continued fraction expansion. And by letting k to be equal to 0, we indeed have this expression here, which is exactly the one of the s fractions that we have seen in the previous slides. And in particular, I just want to mention, because it's going to be useful for the next part of the talk, that if we consider dig paths whose weight is 1 both for the rises and for the fall, then in that case they are enumerated by a particular type of numbers, which are called the Catalan numbers. And in that case, then we are just going to substitute the alpha i's to be all 1, and so the continued fraction expansion is going to have 1 as a coefficient of the t's. And we're going to see in a second why this is useful. So let's first look at an example of how all this theory combines together. So the first one that I want to look at is unlabeled binary trees. So what is a tree? A tree is a connected graph which has no circuit, and in particular its vertices are called nodes. And then a tree is said to be binary, either if it's empty or if it's made of a root, a left and a right, or a right subtree, both of which are binary. So this is an example of unlabeled binary trees. And so for each node, we have that the left child is the left out neighbor and the right child is the right out neighbor. And in particular, if we consider F to be the families of such trees, then we have, in a similar way as we have done with the dig paths, we can see that they satisfy this functional equation where the ft is the ordinary generating function. And this time, solving the quadratic, then we have that the ft as like this as a solution. And so as we can see, we have a plus or a minus here. So, but the ordinary generating function can only be 1. We don't have more than one generating function for a particular family, combinatorial family. So how do we choose whether the plus or the minus is the correct answer? Then we need to look at the expansion of the square root of 1 minus 4t and see what happened. So let's look first of all at the expansion of it, and performing some calculations that I'm gonna skip here, but like with this expression, then we can, by plugging it back in our solution, then we get that if we choose the plus sign, then we're gonna have that the t's at the numerator and at the denominator do not cancel, and therefore we have a singularity at the denominator, which is something that we would like to avoid. Whereas if we choose the minus, then the 1 and the minus 1 would cancel out. So then also the t's at the numerator and denominator will cancel out. And thus we won't have any singularity at the denominator. And this suggests us that indeed we should choose the minus 1 in the expression of the ordinary generating function. And so now that we have this, in order to find the t-ends, we need to rewrite it in terms of a power series. So to do such a thing, again, we look at the expansion of the different terms. And by, again, doing this and performing some calculations, we can see that the coefficient of the tn is represented by this expression here. And therefore, we have that the tn equals this, the expression that we have seen in the previous slide, which by doing again a few computations is of the form 1 over n plus 1 times 2n choose n, which is actually a way to represent Catalan numbers. And therefore, as we have seen before, we have that Catalan numbers also enumerate Dieck paths whose weight are all 1. And because of this bijection between the two, then it must be the case that the continued fraction expansion in this case is the same one that was for the Dieck path of weight 1. And indeed, as I mentioned, we have this the fact that the Tn's and the Dieck paths on 2n of length 2n are enumerated by the same combinatorial object, i.e. by the Catalan numbers, implies that there's a bijection between the two types of objects. And indeed, there exists such a bijection, and yes, unfortunately, I won't have the time to go through it, but in case you would like to, you have any question about it, I can quickly mention later on, but for now, let me skip it. So yeah, but I wanted to put just to mention that such a bijection exists. So another example is the one given by increasing binary trees. And this time, what does it mean with increasing binary trees? Well, first of all, we have to define a single label binary tree, which is again a binary tree where each node is labeled by a number from 1 to n. And then we say that such a tree is increasing if each child has a label that is bigger than the one of its parent. And then we have another bijection, this time between this type of trees and the permutations on the numbers from 1 up to n. And therefore, this means that the number of increasing binary trees on n vertices is given by the number of permutations of such a set, and therefore equals n factorial. And Euler in the 1760 managed to show that this is the continued fraction expansion for this type of trees. So it's the one of the form 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, and so on. And just for curiosity, this is like the actual paper of Euler, which was all written in Latin, which I find really interesting. And then as a fact, and then here, as you can see, we have plus rather than minus, but this is just a matter of notation that changed over the times. Okay, and again, here I described this bijection, but again, I won't have the time to go through it, so I'll just quickly skip it. So yeah, and this was the other, oh no, sorry, this is the one I want to talk about. Okay, so then we have looked at the case of unlabeled binary trees and labeled binary trees. So then we can ask ourselves, is there something similar for maybe not binary trees, but perhaps ternary trees? So when we are allowing three child, and actually we conjecture and partially managed to prove that indeed there is a particular and nice continued fraction expansion for single label increasing ternary trees, such that they have a particular property, i.e. that each parent can have a left, a right, or a middle child, but such that each middle child does not have any sibling. So an example of such tree is given by the one here on the right. But the thing that I want to mention and to emphasize is how we arrived to this conclusion, to this description. We did not start with looking at this particular type of tree and then try to find the continued fraction expansion and the sequence that enumerates them, but actually we started in reverse. So it's the approach that we used is an example of experimental mathematics. And the two main tools that we use is the OEIS and Mathematica. And the OEIS is an amazing tool because it's an online encyclopedia of integer sequences. So one can type in any integer sequence that is interesting, that find interesting. And the OEIS, if such a sequence is known, is going to give you a list of all possible infinite sequence where the sequence you've typed is part of, and then a list of all references and papers where such sequences appear, and even continued fraction expansions or other formulae if are indeed known. And then we also used Mathematica, and in particular we used Mathematica because we wrote a code, Professor Sokol and Dr. Deb wrote a code so that we could start with a t fraction and then find the sequence of number such a t fraction represent in the OEIS. So this is a part of the code that we that we worked on. So as we can see here, it's telling us that the continued fraction expansion that we call MyT2 is like as of the main interpretation as particularly one on the OEIS, which is described by this sequence here. So we managed to prove that indeed, one second, because this is the slide that always take time to refresh. Okay, so but while it's going, we managed to indeed, here we are. We managed to show that these type of three that I mentioned before are enumerated by this sequence of number, which is the one that indeed the Mathematica code gave us, because the Mathematica code gave us the insight that such continued fraction expansion represented had this like a sequence interpretation, but then we thought about, we look at these numbers and doing many computation, we then came up with the idea that such sequence represent the type of trees that I described, and then we needed to prove in a formal mathematical way, and indeed we managed to do such a thing. And now we are proving instead the bijection between the shorter path and these type of trees, so that we can actually prove formally that indeed this type of tree have the T fraction expansion that we started with in the Mathematica code, which is the one whose alpha and deltas are given by the one here on the slide. And then we actually ask ourselves if we can generalize this to multi-labels ternary trees. And indeed, we think that this is possible, and we are actually working on this other aspect as well. So yeah, I guess, yes, this is all I wanted to say today. And this is the list of references that I've used during the project and during when preparing for the talk. So yeah, if you have any question, also feel free to email me and I'll be more than happy to answer. But thank you very much for your attention, and I guess that's all I wanted to say. So if there are any questions, feel free to ask.
Thanks a lot, Veronica. Again, another fantastic talk. So for those who are watching on YouTube or in the audience, I'm sure you can see why these two won in 2023. Are there any questions from the audience at all? If not, I mean, whilst you're all typing, do you have like a 2-minute summary of this bijection, like
Sure.
how you thought about going through it, like where the ideas come from?
Yeah. I'll go 1 second. I mean, this is like the bijections are not like original in the sense that they're not something that we discovered during the project. They were already known. But actually, the interesting fact is some of them, they are not as popular in the literature. So for some of them, we actually needed to go through some like lecture that were given a few years ago by Vienno, François Vienno. But let me actually go to the beginning of the bijection so I can quickly describe them. Okay, so the first one, where is it? Okay. So for this one is like the main thing is like, first of all, one needs to go from the definition of a binary tree to a complete binary tree, where complete is like just that we have that basically each parent either has two children or no child at all. In that case, the bijection is immediate because you just add the missing nodes if you're going to a binary to a complete, and sorry, the missing leaves, and vice versa. You just remove all the leaves if you want to go from a complete to a binary tree. And then once you have a binary tree, you go to its complete binary tree representation. And then to find the dig path, you just basically have to traverse the tree like with what is called the node left and right order. So you traverse the tree, and every time until you go back to the node, and then you go to the right subtree. And every time you see an internal vertex, so these ones are going to be the internal vertices, you're going to add a rise in your dig path, whereas when you see a leaf, you're going to add a fall. So then doing that, basically, you get this as your dig path. And the other way around is that every time instead you have like a rise, you're gonna add a left and a right child to your node, whereas every time you have a fall, you just add a leaf. And again, here you're giving priority to the left side, basically. So you're adding everything to the left side until there's nothing left on the left, and you're forced to go on the right side of the tree, basically. So in this case, like for instance, here we have a rise, we're going up, and so we're adding to our node a left and a child, and then we're going up again, and this node here was like empty, so, and is the more left one, so we give priority to the left, and then we do the same thing until all the left is done, and we go to the right, basically. So this is the first bijection, and then there's like the other one, which let me see. Instead is kind of like a bit short. No, sorry, I did it wrong. Where is it? Yes, here. Which is instead shorter, because this time basically you start with a permutation and you write your permutation in what is called in cycle notation, but in a way that basically sorry. Here you go. In a way that is called the standard representation, so that basically you're going from the largest element from the smallest element to the largest, basically. And then once you have done that first kind of transformation, then you can again look at the bijection between the permutations and the three, and you like splitting your bijection as like I being the smallest element in the permutation, and then a left and a right sub branch, and that is going to define your left sub 3 and right sub 3, and you iterate basically until you're finished. And the other way around is like reading the labels in a symmetric order, so from the left node and right, the node and the right. So it's like again kind of following, iterating every time, because you read first this bit, then the node, and then the right sub 3, and you're doing this over and over again until you're not left every time with just a number, and it is going to give you the final so it's a meta over, which I guess makes sense, because the actual definition of a binary tree is already something that like is kind of like an induction definition, right? Because we define it as like a node and then a left and a right sub 3.
Thank you very much for the quick overview. I don't see any questions in the chat, but I had one, and I may have missed this as I was making notes. You mentioned there were 3 path types at the very beginning, and then you made this bijection between the Dieck path and the continued fraction.
Yeah.
Are you expecting the same for the other 2 types of paths? Did I miss that? Or what? Yeah. That's the question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So like there's like a similar kind of approach for the other 2. It's just like the computations is like slightly more complicated. So I kind of like avoid going it in the presentation, because otherwise it would be too long. But it's exactly the same structure and approach. So like Flageolet had this like really nice idea of like looking at this type of like a continued fraction and managing to find more like a combinatorial interpretation of them. And so like there's a similar approach for the other 2 paths as well. So yeah, absolutely.
That's quite nice. And is there a relationship between this approach and the ODE approach? Like, are they, how would you say, are they similar at all, or?
Okay, so for that, the thing is like basically a different way to view like a generating function. So in that case, basically you're viewing your generating function as a solution of ODE rather than looking at a continued fraction expansion. So it's giving you other type of information, I guess, to your combinatorial object. So it was nice because, for instance, in the sequence that where we conjectured that particular type of ternary trees, there's actually one of the paper that I listed is like that came up with the same sequence going through actually the ordinary generating through the ODE approach, and they actually had a different type of interpretation with a different type of tree. So like it was nice to see how rather than using continued fraction, but the ODE's approach, one can get a different ideas and insight on the sequence of number. So those sequences are actually enumerating two type of trees that are kind of seems to be different, but perhaps maybe there is a bijection between the two, like our interpretation and their interpretation.
Sounds good. And do you anticipate continuing with this work?
So this summer, I'm actually continuing working with like on this stuff, because like as I mentioned, we have this kind of like conjecture that we thought about last summer, and then we wanted to actually like prove in a more formal way what we thought about. So this summer we're basically now working on that, and then hopefully manage to like continue on some other type of combinatorial objects.
Yeah, sounds good. Good luck.
Thank you.
So just in light of time, thank you both. Again, I want to just thank both Maria and Veronica for the time to come and speak to us today. Where's the clap? There it is, the clap. Yeah, so for those who are watching online, I hope you enjoyed. Please leave a comment, like and subscribe if you want to see more of this content. Just as a reminder, this seminar series is brought to you by the Early Career Mathematicians Committee of the IMA. You can look at them and what they do on the website. Our next seminar should be happening soon, and we've invited the winners of this year's Tomorrow's Mathematicians Today, the 2024. So that should be hopefully coming up soon, probably looking like August in some time there. So keep your eyes peeled. That's August 2024 for those watching online, just in case. Yeah, so with that, I bid you all farewell and enjoy the rest of your day.